Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia, and I'll moderate today's webinar while Elizabeth facilitates. If you find that you're not able to hear us at any time, you can go ahead and send me a quick chat message by clicking on the chat message icon and toggling to send me a direct message. If you have any questions for any of the panelists at any time, you can go ahead and click on the Ask a Question icon in your top left corner. I'll receive that question and read it off for our panelists to answer. Questions are kept anonymous, so please don't be shy. With that, I'll toss on over to Elizabeth Beavers.
Thanks so much, Sophia, and thank you to everyone who's joining us, whether it's live or you're watching this training at a later date. We're so excited to share this new resource with you. It's been a long time coming. We have spent a lot of time and brainstorming and put a lot of heart and soul into producing this toolkit. So I'm super honored to be joined tonight by guests who played such an integral role in creating this toolkit and sharing a little bit more about some tips and best practices for how to use it, and just sort of walking through how it might be most useful in your classroom. So you'll see on your screen right now the link to access the toolkit at any time. It is NatSecEDU, that's short for National Security Education, .amnestyusa.org, and this is the link that will take you straight to the microsite that holds the toolkit. It will hold this training webinar. There's going to be a digital video component that's going up in the next couple of weeks. There's an opportunity to submit feedback. There's an opportunity to share actions that are taken. We'll get into all of that, but that's the magic link right there. So we'll show it again at the end, but please do bookmark that, write it down, whatever makes sense for you to keep that link handy. So let's go ahead and jump in. I want to talk to you all a little bit about why we decided to undergo this project. Essentially, this is a toolkit that we created for educators to utilize in their classroom, and it's specifically on issues of national security and human rights. We believe at Amnesty that human rights education is a key component in any sort of human rights activism, that if we're not sharing what human rights are or how they impact us or how we can get involved, then our movement's not going to grow and it's not going to thrive. So this is an important thing about that for us. Specifically on the national security piece, we've got sort of the intro here on the screen, but to save you from having to read, basically we've become really aware in the last few years that the attacks of 9/11 happened more than 15 years ago, which is pretty incredible for me. It certainly doesn't feel like it's been that long. I think, sort of at the tail end of people who had really active memories of what it meant to watch those attacks happen and to understand the world before and after. So, as so many of us know, those attacks did happen, and they were crimes against humanity. They were a terrible tragedy for our nation. And what we've seen since then is the U.S. government's choices with how to respond to that tragedy. And unfortunately, that response has included a number of policies and practices that really threaten human rights. That's included torture, it's included indefinite detention, anti-Muslim discrimination, drone strikes, all sorts of things that really impact the modern access that we have to fully enjoying our human rights. So that's where Amnesty International comes in. As you know, Amnesty International is a global movement that is focused on ensuring that everyone, everywhere, can fully enjoy their human rights. So since we recognize that it, at this point, has been more than 15 years, a lot of young people who are in school right now, don't know about what that world was like before 9/11, or why it's just so outrageous the way the U.S. government has responded, or fully what the implications are of the different policies that have happened. So we wanted to create this toolkit to empower educators with a way to talk about it in the classroom, to share that information, to share that background, and to make sure that students not only know what happened, but they know how they can act today to reverse course and to make sure that these threats don't continue to evolve. So I'm going to move on to my very honored guest speaker here. I'm really delighted to be joined tonight by Christy Rudelius Palmer. Christy is an incredible professional who has decades of experience in human rights education and is an expert on translating those human rights principles into the classroom. And she worked tirelessly and very closely with me as a consultant in creating this toolkit. So I'm going to let her talk a little bit more now that you've heard the sort of background and the scope of what we created here, the approaches that we used and how we set it up and what that means for a modern day classroom. So Christy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. This really was a team effort to try and put this toolkit together. So in terms of the actual approaches that we took on, we really tried to have it be an inclusive, I guess, series of units. So there are 4 units that we really integrated this core of approaches regarding the International Human Rights Framework, the human rights education methodology, media literacy, and then we'll go through also the kind of integration of curricular standards and educational frameworks. So I think we'll jump right now into the actual teacher's guide or educator's guide and just show you a little bit more in detail the information that you will have at your fingertips. So we do use a lot of digital resources. We provided the outline for the modules here in the front section. And then the approaches that we've taken, as I mentioned, include the International Human Rights Framework. So that starts out with a foundational document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we also have integrated 4 different treaties. One is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The second is on International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention Against Torture. There are other references to other treaties and agreements as well, but that is what we kind of talk about as an international human rights framework in actual legal principles and law. Secondly, we have really tried to wrap it around human rights education methodology. And that methodology really is talking about empowering young people, particularly fostering both knowledge, skills, as well as this notion around looking at attitudinal and behavioral changes. We have really integrated not only knowing about human rights, but knowing why you're promoting human rights and how you can actually do it through participatory methodologies. In addition, I think we use a civic engagement approach in this process and really try and have it engaging and linked to the core principles of human rights, including non-discrimination, equality, and enhancing democratic principles of participation. So when we kind of go forward, we're also using the media literacy framework. We know that there's a lot of information out there, and we've attempted to pull from different media sources, a variety of different sources here, and we recognize that students are really inundated with information, as are educators. So what we've attempted to do in the toolkit is give you creative ways of looking at media critically and having students be able to put their own lens and learning, I guess, in the process. So I think we've really attempted to look at national security through multiple lenses, as I've mentioned. I think if we scroll down, we really do believe that a part of the skill that we want students to take away from using this resource is how they can look at media critically and how they can identify, both primary sources, secondary sources, as well as these collections or distillations of kind of a merger of both primary and secondary resources. And in terms of the curricular standards and the educational frameworks that we've used, We've used and focused on the social studies C3 framework on college, career, and civic life readiness for the social studies standards, the Common Core English Language Arts and Literacy standards, and then we've also integrated kind of the service learning approach. And instead of putting those into each unit specifically, we've provided you with these frameworks up front in the educator's guide, so you can see these core, like in the C3 framework of social studies, you can see the 4 core areas of inquiry, from developing questions and planning inquiries, to applying disciplinary tools and concepts in civics, to evaluating the sources and using the evidence, and finally communicating conclusions and taking informed actions. So that is obviously a frame from the C3 framework in social studies, but we've also then linked in with the service learning practices, kind of effective practices and standards. That gets down to the meaningful service, the link to the curriculum, reflection, diversity, focus on a youth voice, finding kind of that engagement component, looking at partnerships, working in communities through community service and action, looking at how you can kind of monitor progress, and finally, you know, what the duration and intensity of the work is. We have highlighted here the IPARD cycle, which in service learning, that really focuses on kind of the I for investigating the issue, P for planning and preparation on how to address the issue. The A is for action, the R is for reflection, and then the D finally is for the demonstration of learning. And we see that as a holistic model too, that hopefully all of the different units really have integrated and embedded. And then lastly, we focus here on for the language arts standards, that notion of the range of reading. So we've used multiple different media sources. The I for informative explanatory writing. And so we do have a number of written activities in this process. And finally, that speaking and listening skill, where students are also able to present the knowledge and their ideas in concrete action. We do have actions built into each of the units. Here, what we've attempted to do is lay out just 2 general rubrics that can be used with this toolkit. One is the presentation or a summative rubric that you can use if you are interested. And then the second one is focused on doing actually concrete action. So it is focused on the advocacy, kind of a letter rubric that can be used. We recognize, and one of the challenges to create these units was we know everyone is working with different assessment structures and requirements within your own institution and within your school district and your state, as well as then, you know, across the United States. So we've, I guess, attempted to have these kind of rubrics as at least general frameworks, but we really encourage you also to think about how you may want to measure and assess your own students' learning.
Thank you so much, Christy. That was really great. I hope that was really useful for everyone to understand how this toolkit might be used practically in a classroom and integrate into pre-existing structures and systems. Actually, we think this might be a great moment to take a break in case there's any questions so far. Let me actually just pull this up. We'll definitely give an opportunity for questions at the end as well, after we dive a little more into the subject matter and the actual content of the lessons and activities. But in case that there's any questions about background or scope or the approaches that Christy mentioned, how something corresponds with what's going on in your classroom, we definitely have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions now. So I'll turn it over to Sophia if she has any questions to raise for us from the audience.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. And just as a reminder for any folks who may have joined after the beginning of today's webinar, if you do have a question, you can just go ahead and click on the Ask a Question icon in the top left of your screen, and then I'll read it off for the panelists. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Sophia. Are there any that have been raised yet that we can answer? We probably have time for a couple of questions before we move into the content of the toolkit.
Yeah, great. Here we go. If our first question today is what ages of students are ideal for this toolkit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can start that, and then if Christy might have something to add to it. So we designed this toolkit in mind for students ages 16 to 20, which obviously kind of covers late high school, early university. But we're definitely mindful that a number of different classrooms, some that fall below or above that age range, might have interest in incorporating these materials into the classroom. You know your classroom best. What we try to do here is provide the building blocks for modification or inclusion into your classroom as it makes sense. We do think that ages 16 to 20 is sort of the ideal age range for this material, but Christy, do you have any other thoughts on if other ages would want to use the toolkit or anything more on that?
I think you handled it well. I mean, I do think that there are definitely some of the lessons that can easily be adapted for younger audiences as well as older audiences. I think a lot of the background readings are really useful for even higher education levels. So I think I do agree that the range that we've targeted right now is that 16 to 20-year-old, but I think it can be adapted easily for others.
Okay, great. Is there maybe one or two more questions so far, Sophia?
Yep, thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Christy. Our next question is, what kinds of classes in terms of subject matter are appropriate to use this toolkit in?
Great. Oh, that's really good. So, I think the beauty of human rights education is that it's, sometimes I think we think about it like it's a legal issue or it's a social studies issue. And while that's certainly true, human rights affects every aspect of our lives. And so it's appropriate for any number of disciplines. We've heard feedback from educators so far that they plan to use it in different types of classrooms, such as, of course, things like civics or government or social studies, but also English, literature, law, art, journalism, even certain, STEM classes, science and math, have thought about, there are any number of careers and academic disciplines where these issues will be confronted. Today's students are tomorrow's engineers, newscasters, professors, journalists, you name it. So having a full grasp of recent history and the human rights implications and what it means to be civically engaged around those are not limited to any particular discipline. So we've tried to, again, just sort of create building blocks that can be modified and used in your classroom across multiple disciplines. And, we think with some creativity, it could be used in multiple different types of classrooms, and we're actually really eager to hear feedback from different kinds of educators. Christy or Amber, I know we haven't been introduced to Amber yet, but she might have something to say on this. I'll introduce her next, but Amber is a student activist who's going to speak with us in a minute. Amber, do you or Christy have any other thoughts on the types of classrooms where this toolkit and human rights education could be incorporated? Oh, Amber, I think you're on mute.
So maybe I'll jump in while she's trying to work on her the voice. I think definitely you gave a very good overview, Elizabeth, that it really can be integrated into a wide variety of the different disciplines. And I think it takes the creative or the teacher to try and understand how these it flows nicely into their classroom. Obviously, they have various educational demands in terms of outcomes and meeting what their requirements are. But I do think that these tools will be able to complement that and really meet those learning standards as well.
Can all of you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so I was actually talking about this earlier, and in terms of human rights education within the classroom just generally, I think there's this perception that younger people sort of that it's something that should be learned later, because sometimes topics are, especially when it has to do with torture, they can be a little bit heavy. In my experience, I actually had this sort of strange experience where a lot of teachers didn't keep us away from that kind of issue from a sort of early age. And I think people have this tendency to sort of like underestimate what younger high school kids and maybe some middle schoolers can handle. So I definitely think that, you know, teachers know what their students are able to handle and learn. And I think definitely with some caution that, you know, it doesn't have to be 16 to 20 somethings, that it definitely, you can try to teach this from an early stage. And I think that's even better because, I don't know, for me, it's the earlier you learn about these kinds of issues, the better, because then you can get involved, which is what I will talk about a little bit. But also, and also adults as well, like adults, especially that spent their time in fields are a little bit different, like especially STEM fields that haven't really thought about these issues as well. Like that is super important that you can bring to your community, however you interact. If you have meetings of some kind with your community, if you can also try to bring that in, because there are a lot of people that don't think about this and have not thought about it ever, and they also need to be exposed to it a little bit. So that's what I will say for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Amber. And I think that's actually probably a really good segue into the next segment where Amber will speak with us a little further. Let me just go to the next slide and introduce Amber. So you've already heard her speak a little bit, but Amber Martin is a National Youth Action Coordinator with Amnesty International USA. She also is the co-founder of the student action group Seminoles Against Torture. And for a little more context on this particular project, Amber was gracious enough to spend her summer in my office last summer and to help brainstorm and come up with this project. And so Amber is responsible for the early day brainstorming about someday when we might create a resource where educators could talk about national security and human rights in the classroom. And so partly due to her vision and her own story and how she's been impacted by human rights education and how that's moved her to action, this resource is here today. So I wanted to make sure to include her in this conversation. Amber, I'll hand it over to you to give us your perspective from that student side of things, why human rights education is important more generally, and then this resource specifically, how you see it as being helpful in the broader movement against human rights that are threatened by national security.
Great, thank you. Yes, so just a little small background about me in terms of Amnesty. So how I kind of got involved, especially when it comes to human rights education, is that I took a class called Just Torture with a professor at Florida State University. And for, I think, 3 hours a week, and like 3 hours straight, the class was once a week, we would just focus on the topic of torture overall. We had a book, a book a week to read. It was very intense, but it was a very deep dive into this issue that I hadn't considered ever. And a big part of that class was talking about not torture in the past, which is, I think, something that a lot of people think about torture being something that people used to do and that governments used to do. a long time ago, but also how modern day torture looks like and how democracies are sometimes involved in that, and how unfortunately the United States has and been involved and continues to sort of perpetuate this this practice. And for me, that class, like, I think the main theme that the main thing that I learned from it was that it was so shocking that how little I knew about that. You know, at that time, I considered myself a pretty educated person. I knew about things that other people didn't consider a lot, and I thought I was well informed in most things. And it turned out that I really had no idea what the United States had been involved with in the early days and to this day, in terms of torture and illegal detention of people. And there's so many people, and it wasn't just me. Like, there was a part of me that thought maybe I was just kind of the only stupid one that didn't know about this. But just going around my own community and around people that I considered to be very intelligent, it was just not something that people spoke about. And it was still going on. Like, there's still today people in Guantanamo. And it's kind of, it seems like this thing where, well, we accepted it. Like, they're still there, it's still happening, but everybody kind of just, well, or not everybody, obviously, but there was just not national conversation going on. And I actually did a research paper about this. And if you just Google, okay, how many times was this searched? How many times did people look this up? There was a brief spike in 2014 when the Senate torture report came out in December. So that for maybe a couple weeks. And then after that, it just died down and never came back into the news cycle. But the problem is still there. And I think I attributed a lot of that to the lack of education around human rights issues in general, and especially around human rights issues that intersect with national security, because I think that's an area where we all struggle, where we want to feel safe. We know that there are dangerous people and things out there, but we also, like, we want to respect human dignity and life. So in this sort of area of human rights, a lot of people kind of turn their backs because it's just easier. And it's also, it's complicated. It involves a lot of history. It involves a lot of CIA reports and come out years later and no one wants to listen to. So after this class, I decided, my friends and I, we all decided, well, we're going to get together. And that's how sort of Stem Against Torture happened. We're going to get together. We're going to put together a conference that educates people on torture. And we spent an entire year not just organizing the conference, but having weekly meetings every day with other students about this issue. Because I didn't pay because I got a grant, but someone paid $600 for me to sit down and take this class. And it's crazy. Like, why do you have to pay $600? And I go to a relatively cheap school. Like, if you go somewhere that's private and expensive and really fancy, it's probably going to be maybe $2,000 for you to take this class and learn about something that everyone should know about. I think that should be part of public education. That should be something that adults and young people know about, because that's, the mistake is that we say these kind of things like, well, we'll never let this happen again, or that was a mistake of the past. But if people in the past made this mistake and you don't learn about it, you try to hide it, your government tries to hide it because they're trying to sort of not be held responsible for it. If they don't want that to be a blip in their history, like they don't want that to be in their biographies and things that people write about them. So we never learn. So we just repeat what we do over and over. and we have to relearn this lesson, which is that torture doesn't work. It is cruel, it's inhumane, and that, you know, drone strikes haven't shown themselves to be something that is palatable to the modern human rights framework, and that detaining people illegally is also not a good idea. There's just a lot of things that people are missing out. And I think student activists especially have a really big space to fill in this, and activists in general, because, you know, for example, I live in the South. Sometimes bring in these things directly to the classroom, like there's still high school teachers who struggle with parents because they're teaching evolution. So something as, you know, as controversial as this can take time to sort of put into the classroom. So I think, you know, sometimes you have to do your own work. You know, that's why my friends and I started doing human rights work, because we saw, well, not everyone's learning about this, not everyone's taking these classes. I know I want to take a lot of human rights classes, but a lot of other people don't. So I'm going to bring this to others. And if I have access to it, but other people don't. A module or something on the internet somewhere where people can learn, that gives access to a lot of people who don't have the privilege of getting higher education and paying $600 per credit hour for a class. So I think this is very important. And I was very happy, very, very happy to work with Elizabeth last summer in my cubicle, which I got to visit last weekend, and get this project started. And, you know, I'm pretty sure I'm going to give out my contact information later. So if you're a student activist especially, and you think, well, maybe I can't teach people about this, or I can't access this information, like, you definitely can, and you can definitely go to your community and scream it from the rooftops and have people learn, because that's how I do it. That's how I taught my parents. My parents didn't know about this. They didn't like I was bringing it up, but I did it, and now they know better. So when it comes to human rights education, I think something really important is that we have to educate in our own communities. Not everything's learned in this classroom, but we can definitely bring things that we learn in the classroom to our homes and to the places that we're in, because that's where we spend most of our time anyway. So I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover.
Thank you so much, Amber. It's so great to have you in this conversation and to have you as part of this project. So just a reminder, again, I know we've gotten a couple of questions. Please do use the Q&A tab on your screens to submit questions, and we will be sure to address those at the end. So thank you very much for sticking with us. We're going to jump now into getting a little bit more into the content of the toolkit itself. I am going to start first here with Module 1. Now, just as a reminder, there are actually 4 modules in this toolkit. Each one covers a distinct area that's really important for national security and human rights work. Of course, that in and of itself, I mean, if we talk about human rights more broadly, even with that's a gigantic portfolio, and then within that, just national security work that intersects with human rights, that's enormous too. So what we did is our best here to sort of group things into broader categories that certainly don't provide the exhaustive and comprehensive encyclopedia by any means on each of these categories, but it at least gives those building blocks to incorporate into a classroom and to facilitate further learning. And at the end of each module, we actually have a list of going further resources, where upon completion of the activities and lesson plans in these modules, if you or your class are interested in going further, the resources are there. So I'm going to start first with Module 1. Module 1 is the Introduction to Human Rights and National Security, which by itself sounds enormous. What we were trying to do here is put together a module where if your classroom is not one that already includes just sort of the core you know, what is human rights? Where do they come from? What do we mean when we say human rights? And what does national security have to do with that? What do we mean when we say national security? This is the module for your classroom. Some classrooms might already have delved into this material, and this module might not be as necessary. We did design this toolkit where each of the modules could be used on their own, and they could stand alone if they need to, but they're much better when combined. So if your classroom is not one that has delved into those foundational blocks of what human rights are, then this is a perfect place to start. So I'm just going to go over here and sort of broadly so you can expect what you might find in this module. The questions that we ask here are, what are the key laws and principles of human rights? What are the various understandings and meanings of security? What is the relationship between security and human rights? How do national security concerns and policies influence human rights? And how should human rights principles and laws influence national security policies? The learning objectives, which means that after this module is finished, here's what we expect that students will take away. They'll be able to demonstrate the knowledge of the content of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Christy referenced earlier, and other key sources of international human rights law. Again, you know, this doesn't have to be in a legal class. It doesn't have to be in a sort of foundational political science class. Knowledge of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a really foundational thing that could work across many disciplines and impact so many different ways that we approach the world. So this is a really good sort of broad overview for a classroom that hasn't yet been exposed to human rights. And you know, we find all the time at Amnesty that people have a lot of familiarity with the term human rights, but in terms of what that actually means and what rights we're referring to, there's not always that follow-up in-depth knowledge, and so this module will provide that. Students will also be able to demonstrate knowledge of human rights principles such as equality, non-discrimination, participation, responsibility, accountability, interdependence, universality, and inalienability, and apply them to the analysis of issues related to security and rights. They'll be able to demonstrate knowledge of limitations and derogations under international human rights law, and apply this knowledge to debates and cases related to human rights and national security. Critically analyze human rights and identify the challenges and critiques. Reflect upon personal attitudes, values, and behaviors in relation to human rights principles and laws, as well as U.S. policies and practices. Compare and contrast various viewpoints and critically engage in dialogues regarding human rights and U.S. national security policies and practices. Lastly, they'll learn how to model human rights principles in the classroom. So that's sort of foundationally what we've set up this module for, and I'll turn it over to Christy to give some illustrations of activities from this module.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So each session, each unit, I'll say, has a number of different sessions. We've attempted to have each session about 1 hour for kind of the processing. So we believe that this very first lesson around group agreements is really a foundational lesson for actually all of the units, because it allows students to begin to form what their own kind of group norms and standards are for how are they going to learn together. And I think it gets into kind of what is the space and kind of how will they have either brave conversations, courageous conversations around these topics. While they may not agree all the time, how can they then kind of push forward and have the conversations with a respectful frame of reference? So as we go forward, they have various warm-up exercises to get really a bit more comfortable with human rights and security. And so this is where there's not only the blend, as Elizabeth mentioned, kind of that foundational exploration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but what's unique to this toolkit is it really begins to give us a window into how does security and national security fit in with these this framework of human rights. So I think we end up having in each unit, there's also, we just passed some of those action steps or homework assignments as well. So here in session 2, this one dove into more of the core principles around human rights. that we were discussing, and then gave them an opportunity to be a little bit more active in the classroom on this human rights scavenger hunt. I won't go into more detail on that. I think, and so then the actual scavenger hunt is in that session 3. They will be able to look at various media research components, and I guess that's part of activity 2. And then there's the homework assignment as well. I think we'll focus more attention now on the 4th session, because this one gives kind of the framework of really what are human rights and national security, so those rules and restrictions that apply to this kind of in human rights and national security. And we give a concrete scenario here that they're able to actually jump in and feel more comfortable in. So now I think we're going to jump over to Unit 2.
Sorry, no, that was my fault. I accidentally jumped out. You have time if you want to say anything else about that. I just clicked the wrong thing. Or is that all you wanted to say about that?
Well, maybe we can go in more depth on this first unit, so the educators or the student activists on the line can see at least the overall frame. So if you can scroll down a little bit further, I'll show you. We do have in some of the units this exit ticket example. So this is when your students are leaving, how can they actually show that they have actually understood a number of the concepts that have been handled during the day. We then also have take action and homework components that allow students to go and do even further research on their own. And have asked some of those key questions. So in this activity 4, some of those key questions for homework about what does security mean to you, so that they really can personally try to apply this notion of security and what makes you feel secure. And then we're able to bridge it over to kind of the whole notion about what do we think the government responsibility is in that security element. Now, if you scroll all the way down, a little further, we have handouts in each of the units. So here is kind of the outline of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and going at the very there's background sheets so that you have kind of that nice summary, whether it's looking at the principles or right here some of the specific articles that do link up with security that you'll be working with on the lessons. The ICCPR, as I mentioned earlier, or the ICECR are the international covenants on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. So we actually have some handouts in the scavenger hunt that actually help students become more familiar with those different treaties. And I think the final component of each unit, after all of the handouts, are the kind of going further, or at least a list of resources that students may want to look at further, or you may assign them as educators to, if you have a higher level class, more time, you're able to dive into some of these other resources with your students as well, or we hope so. So
Great.
I think let's jump to Unit 2. Thanks.
Yeah, and just a reminder to everyone, we're giving you sort of a sneak peek of the modules here. They are available for your free download at NATSEC.edu, and we'll have it up on the screen at the end again, NATSEC.edu.amnestyusa.org, and there you can find this full resource. So we'll jump to Module 2 now. Again, any of these can stand on their own, but ideally you would do this one after Module 1, after you've set up that foundation of understanding what human rights are and where they come from, that's when we turn to the global post 9/11 war paradigm that has been so pervasive since 2001. This is that forever state of war that so many current students have never known a life without this. They've never known a United States not in a permanent state of war. So that's what this module is trying to get at, both how the global war paradigm was launched and how it's been carried forward by Presidents Bush, Obama, and now President Trump. And especially how lethal force, using global killing powers, particularly with the rise of technologies such as unmanned drones, how that's facilitated and supported the continued state of global endless war. And this module also gets into the impact that has on civilians globally, not just what it means legally, right? Like how a constant endless state of war challenges the principles that are enshrined both in international human rights law, which we discussed in Module 1, but also the laws of war, which are also called international humanitarian law. And the principle here is that even war has rules. And what we're trying to do here is challenge students and their educators to think about the reality and the facts and how those line up, and how, if we do an analysis of what is provided for by the laws of war and by international human rights law, is what the U.S. government is doing lawful? And even if so, what impact does that have on civilians on the ground? And what we try to do here is give those facts, give those scenarios, give the standards and the laws, and then allow your class to do that analysis and reach their conclusions and take action if they're so moved. So the learning objectives here, as we mentioned, are to explore key rights implicated by a global war posture, including international human rights and international humanitarian law. We'll evaluate global lethal force operations through a human rights lens and explore the impact of secret, endless global war on civilians and assess U.S. responsibilities under international law. Christy, I'll quickly turn it over to you for an illustrative lesson from this unit.
Okay, let's scroll down to session 3. We'll try and dive a little bit more into session 3. So in particular, and I will also give you a little bit of a frame. So each of these sessions do have the objectives. They have the materials on the left side that refer to all of the handouts that would be needed for this, this session, which is approximately an hour for each, in each of the sessions. So this activity kind of takes on what is actually the impact of drone strikes. And we do integrate a couple of different videos here. One was the Barack Obama Drone Strikes Have Saved Lives. That's a video that was, I guess, from The Guardian, so that students can actually see some concrete video coming from points in time. And then the Dirty War video that we've pulled out a snippet of that. And it allows students to, at the beginning, to really start saying, well, what do you know about even the use of drones, and that they're able to agree and disagree on various concepts. But then you're able to have that deeper conversation around what are the direct and indirect effects of U.S. global war operations, and how do these operations actually affect the surrounding communities. Students are asked to really look for evidence within the various videos to support their position or contradict contradictions, or what they may actually have questions, more questions than answers here. So students are able to then have the dialogues and discussions further around this topic area. Again, we do have their stands, have they changed positions as they're going forward and beginning to learn a bit more about the actual impacts around the use of drones. So that is kind of a snippet of an activity. We then also want to really make it real. So the Maimana Bibi case study is actually a situation that Amnesty International had done a video about this case, and it allows students to actually read about the concrete case and then begin to really look at, well, what was the strike lawful? Is there more information that they need in order to make that decision? What impact did the strike have on her family? And then did the U.S. government acknowledge the strike or provide any remedy? What injustices need to be addressed? What might be the most effective way for addressing them? So we really want students to be able to critically think about what was going on and what is the sense of responsibility in terms of actions. And then the handout 7 actually calls on them to really take action and look at applying what they've learned through the Maimane Bibi case and other global lethal force discussions that they'd be having to actually submit an action. And we provide that avenue here on the website where they can actually submit their action if desired.
Thanks, Christy. And as Christy mentioned, right here, I'm highlighting it with my cursor. That is the URL that I mentioned where you can access this full toolkit in addition to providing feedback and reporting on actions. I see we're running just a little low on time, so I'm going to jump us into Module 3 and then quickly into Module 4 so that we still have a few minutes left over for questions at the end. Module 3 pertains to detention and torture that the U.S. government has pursued post 9/11. This includes both CIA black site torture as well as Guantanamo and other instances of military detention. So in this module, students will identify post 9/11 U.S. counterterrorism policies that threaten human rights, including the use of torture, enforced disappearance, and arbitrary and indefinite detention. They'll understand the standards of international law prohibiting torture to which the U.S. has legally committed itself, apply human rights analysis to modern debates and discussions surrounding torture, enforced disappearance, and indefinite detention, take action on issues of national security and human rights, especially to end and prevent torture, enforced disappearance, and indefinite detention. That's all I'll say about that. Christy, do you have an illustrative activity you can highlight for us?
Well, let's just jump down to session 4.
Sure.
And I'll just say a couple things on this session. This one really the activity in particular I wanted to highlight was the universal period review simulation here. This one really allows the students to understand that whole process, as well as then they're able to use the handout to actually develop their own responses, so that students are able to instruct students on their papers that they will introduce kind of the human rights issue and the position area and really dive a little bit further into what would it take to actually to be on the working group of the UPR.
Thanks, Chrissy. That's one of my favorite activities in this whole toolkit. It's very cool. Not only does it dive into the subject matter, but it also allows students to get sort of that simulated firsthand experience of what it means to engage with a human rights body that enforces, that monitors compliance and also does fact-finding on what governments are doing to comply with their human rights standards, which includes the United States. So lastly here, we have a module on anti-Muslim discrimination and surveillance. This module gets us into U.S. government policies that use discriminatory surveillance to harass and monitor American Muslim communities in the name of national security, and especially what students face under some of these policies. These learning objectives will allow students to analyze one's personal role and responsibility in recognizing and addressing discriminatory policies and behaviors in defending human rights, as well as explore the rights to freedom of expression, association and assembly, thought, conscience, and religion, and how they're threatened by discriminatory surveillance. Christy, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, let's jump down to session 5. And one thing while you're scrolling down that I might say is this unit, I think, especially right now, is so relevant and important. We know that conversations are, I mean, we need to have conversations in schools because there's a lot of fear out there. On a daily basis, I'm hearing from educators who are, and principals, you know, who are really having challenges with how to address kind of what's going on in schools right now with the fear and the constant hate crimes that are happening. So I think that this unit really is so important, I think, to really come to bring communities together in schools, having schools able to address and really think about what can they do to both create climates for learning as well as making sure that the students in their schools are feeling comfortable and can really talk with each other as well as in the classroom. So I'm just focusing right now on session 5, which is actually an editorial drafting process. So this one really looks at surveillance and discriminatory policies, and specifically looks at assessing students' ability to apply a human rights lens to current incidents of harassment, discrimination, or hate in their school. And it allows them then to kind of draft an editorial, and activity 2 allows them also to go through a simulation on what can happen, you know, with discriminatory surveillance. And I think it allows students to have space and a concrete lesson activity that they can then learn skills from so that they can take action. And so the actual homework and action is writing a letter to a school board or on a decision that they think really needs to be highlighted within their own school.
Thanks so much, Christy. So I know we just have a couple of minutes left. Thank you everyone who's joined us. I do want to reiterate here is again the link to the toolkit. We are looking for educators to pilot this in your classroom to use this resource. It's 100% free. We are not asking for any money from you. All we're asking is for your honest feedback and for you to tell us about the experience and let us know how we can improve. So please do visit this website as soon as possible. Sign up to try it out in your classroom, and we'll engage with you on how we can improve the resource and how we can get that feedback from you. So just quickly, Sophia, is there maybe a question or two that we can address before we part ways?
Yes, absolutely. So we've got our next question from the group is, how might these materials be incorporated into the preparation and credentialing of social studies teachers?
That's perfect for Ms. Christy Rodelius-Palmer. Go for it.
Well, I think it's really important. I think that these tools can actually be used with those students, even though it's targeted at undergraduate students. I think that these tools and having even pre-service teachers begin to think about, well, what are the ethics? What is the classroom climate that they want to set up? What about that school environment? Because they are grappling with this. Many states actually do have human rights standard requirements in social studies. And I know that the National Council for the Social Studies has actually supported the human rights education as being really pivotal for social studies integration. So I think that if I were a pre-service educator of future teachers, I would actually use some of these exact lessons in the classroom, and then they may be able to provide critiques of those lessons, what is missing, and even give us some feedback on how things could be improved. But I do think that the current issues right now that are happening in the news, I think social studies teachers have to be able to bring that current conversation in a safe space and in a learning opportunity to teach skills around how do we take action, how do we able to speak up and communicate well. So that's how I would take that on.
Great. Sophia, do we have time for maybe another question?
Yeah, if folks don't need to jump, then we can go ahead and take a couple more questions. Our next question is, I'm concerned that my school administrator or some of the parents might think that this is propaganda for students. What are some recommended responses?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, we're at a point in our society where the notion of human rights is in itself seen as radical in certain spaces. And what we have really tried to do here, Amnesty International, it's not like a secret who we are. Clearly, we are an organization that presses full on for the enjoyment of human rights for all people, no matter who they are. And particularly what I focus on in my work is how national security policies can threaten human rights. And sometimes that leads us to arguing that no one should be tortured, even if they've committed some sort of awful crime, even if though certain governments might call them dangerous or what have you. Sometimes that's seen as radical, but what we've tried to do here is stick to, here are the facts, here's the law, here are the standards, and then providing those elements where students can engage in analysis. The approaches that Christy highlighted for us show that what we're trying to do is enhance the literacy with how students read the news and how they approach the world. What does it look like through a human rights lens? All we can do is offer that lens. I think students are rightfully skeptical when anyone tries to give them what to think about something, and we don't do that in this toolkit. What we do is provide real-world examples and facts about what are happening, and the ability to see that through a human rights lens, and then really it's up to you in your classroom what to do with it from there. I don't know if Amber or Christy, you have anything to weigh in on that?
I would just add that one reason that we did try to provide various different media sources and case studies was so that it could attempt to pull in different voices in this process. I think that there are also opportunities for students to go out and find their own resources as well. And I think hopefully the skills that will be taught are able to critically think about those resources and be able to make sure that the students are asking the questions about where are those sources coming from, who's telling these stories, how do I find a source that may be, quote, unbiased, as we know all, where does the bias come from? So I think that that's where the media critique is really important, I think. And I think first-person narratives, of which we did pull a number of first-person narratives, I think is really important to at least go back to some of those original sources.
Great. Amber, anything else you want to say before we close down here?
Yeah. In terms of that, I would say it, and this is more for like the sort of one-on-one interaction. I would say it's a sort of consider like how you would view those behaviors reversed. So especially when it comes to detention, torture, using drones, those kind of things. Like think about it when you're interacting with someone who's maybe pushing a little bit back on you. Maybe ask them, so what would you think if X country who you consider an enemy did this to an American citizen? You'd be rightfully outraged, and it's because the action itself is immoral and illegal, and so on and so on. So it's a sort of allowing. It's important to sort of, when you talk to people about this, I think it's important to just focus on the action itself and saying this is behavior that you wouldn't accept from any person, any government, any human being, and that just because we happen to be on the side that we generally agree with a country that we love and care about, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be critical as well. And I would say it's a better testament of your character and your love for your country that you're willing to criticize and say, that I will not accept this, because you want the best for your nation, and that's not the best. So yeah, that's all I say.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think that's a great way to close out. I know we're at time here, so I just want to reiterate, please do visit this URL that's on your screen, natsecedu.amnestyusa.org. You'll find the full toolkit there. There's an upcoming video resource. This webinar will be posted there for use in training others and how to use this resource. And of course, the opportunity to give feedback and become a piloter. Thank you everyone so much for joining us, both live and those who are joining us via recording at a later date. Thank you to Sophia for facilitating for us, to Christy for single-handedly making sure this project happened, and to Amber for helping us dream it up. I am so grateful for all of you, and we look forward to working together in furtherance of human rights education. So thanks everyone.
Bye.